There exists a moment in every person's life when they stand at the crossroads of power and weakness. It happens when criticism strikes, when accusations fly, when the world seems to demand an explanation. And in that moment, most people make the fatal mistake that will haunt them for years to come. They open their mouths and begin to explain. Today, we're going to explore why this instinct to defend yourself is not just wrong, it's deadly to your influence, your reputation, and your power. We'll uncover the ancient strategies that have been used by history's most formidable figures to turn moments of attack into opportunities for dominance. Picture this scenario: you walk into a room where you know people have been talking about you. You can feel the tension, see the sideways glances, sense the whispered conversations that suddenly stop when you appear. Your heart rate increases. Your palms grow slightly damp. And then someone, emboldened by the group's energy, decides to confront you directly. "We heard what you said about the Johnson Project," they announce, their voice carrying just enough accusation to make everyone else lean in. Care to explain yourself? In this moment, 99% of people will do exactly what their attacker expects. They'll stumble into explanation mode. They'll say something like, "Oh, you must have misunderstood," or "That's not what I meant at all," or worse yet, they'll launch into a detailed justification of their actions, their words, their intentions. And in doing so, they've just handed over their power on a silver platter. Here's what most people don't understand about human psychology: the very act of explaining yourself to someone implies that they have authority over you. It suggests that their opinion matters enough to warrant your time and energy. It positions you as the defendant in a courtroom where they've appointed themselves as judge and jury. But power doesn't explain itself. Power doesn't justify. Power doesn't beg for understanding. Think about the most powerful people you know, either personally or from history. When was the last time you saw them frantically explaining themselves to critics? When did you witness them desperately trying to clear their name through lengthy justifications? You didn't, because they understand something fundamental about human nature that most people miss entirely. Human beings are strange creatures. We like to think we're rational, that we make decisions based on facts and evidence. But the truth is far more complex and far more useful for those who understand it. People don't judge you based on what you say when you're defending yourself. They judge you based on the fact that you felt the need to defend yourself in the first place. Your explanation isn't heard as clarification, it's interpreted as desperation. Your justification isn't seen as honesty, it's viewed as weakness. This is because, deep in our evolutionary wiring, we associate confidence with strength and explanation with guilt. Think about it: innocent people don't typically spend their time explaining their innocence. They go about their business, secure in the knowledge of their own character. Guilty people, on the other hand, are constantly trying to convince others, and often themselves, that they're not as bad as they appear. When you rush to explain yourself, you're unconsciously sending the signal that there might be something to explain. You're suggesting that the accusation has merit, that there's a case to be answered, that you're worried about what people might think if you don't set the record straight. But here's the twist that changes everything: when you don't explain yourself, when you remain calm and unperturbed in the face of accusations, people begin to wonder if perhaps the accuser is the one with the problem. Your silence becomes a kind of psychological judo, using your opponent's energy against them. Throughout history, the most effective leaders have understood this principle intuitively. Take Winston Churchill, for example. When faced with criticism about his military strategies during World War II, he didn't launch into detailed explanations of his decision-making process. Instead, he would often respond with a simple, "History will be the judge of that," and then move on to more important matters. Or consider Steve Jobs, a modern master of this technique. When critics questioned Apple's design choices or business decisions, Jobs rarely felt compelled to justify them. His typical response was some variation of, "We know what we're doing," followed by a continuation of his planned agenda. This wasn't arrogance, it was strategic communication. These leaders understood that power is largely about perception, and perception is shaped not by what you say, but by how you carry yourself when others try to diminish you. They knew that the moment you start explaining yourself, you've accepted the premise that you owe someone an explanation. And once you've accepted that premise, you've placed yourself in a subordinate position. Recent research in neuroscience has given us fascinating insights into why this dynamic exists. When we encounter someone who remains calm and undefensive in the face of criticism, our brains interpret this as a sign of high status and competence. Conversely, when we see someone who becomes flustered and begins explaining themselves, our neural pathways associated with detecting weakness and vulnerability light up. This isn't conscious prejudice, it's hardwired biology. Our ancestors survived by quickly identifying who was strong enough to follow and who was weak enough to dominate. Those who could remain composed under pressure were more likely to be effective leaders, while those who crumbled at the first sign of conflict were less trustworthy in dangerous situations. Modern social dynamics haven't changed as much as we might think. The boardroom operates on many of the same principles as the ancient savannah. The person who can maintain their composure and authority when challenged is still more likely to be followed, respected, and ultimately successful. This is why techniques like strategic silence and controlled redirection are so powerful. They tap into these deep psychological patterns, positioning you as the alpha in the situation without requiring you to actually dominate or intimidate anyone overtly. When we talk about strategic silence, it's important to understand that we're not talking about being mute or passive. Strategic silence is an active choice, a calculated decision to withhold your energy from unproductive battles. It's the difference between being quiet because you have nothing to say and being quiet because you have so much power that you don't need to say anything. True strategic silence involves several key components: confident body language, your posture, facial expression, and overall demeanor should communicate that you're unbothered by the attack. This doesn't mean being arrogant or dismissive, but rather projecting the kind of calm assurance that comes from knowing your own worth. Strategic timing. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all, but other times a brief, well-chosen phrase can be more effective than complete silence. The key is timing, knowing when to speak and when to let your silence do the talking. Emotional regulation. This is perhaps the most important aspect. Strategic silence only works if it comes from a place of genuine calm, not suppressed rage or hidden insecurity. You must actually be comfortable with who you are and confident in your position. Purposeful redirection. When you do choose to speak, it should be to redirect the conversation toward more productive topics or to subtly shift the focus back onto your accuser. This isn't about being manipulative, it's about refusing to get dragged into unwinnable arguments. One of the most powerful tools in the strategic communicator's arsenal is what I call the mirror technique. Instead of defending against an accusation, you reflect it back in the form of a question that reveals something about your accuser's motivations. For instance, if someone accuses you of being secretive about a project, instead of explaining all the reasons why you've been discreet, you might simply ask, "Why do you feel entitled to that information?" This immediately shifts the dynamic. Now they're the one who needs to justify their position, while you remain in the position of authority. Or if someone suggests that you're being unfair in a negotiation, rather than listing all the ways you've been reasonable, you could respond with, "What would you do in my position?" This forces them to think through your perspective while simultaneously avoiding the trap of defensive explanation. The beauty of this technique is that it doesn't require you to be confrontational or aggressive. You're simply asking reasonable questions that happen to put the spotlight back on your accuser. Most people aren't prepared for this reversal, and they often end up revealing more about their own insecurities and motivations than they intended. There's an economic principle at play here that most people miss. Attention is a finite resource, and where you spend your attention determines your perceived value. When you spend time explaining yourself to critics, you're essentially telling the world that their opinion is worth your precious time and energy. But consider the alternative. When you refuse to engage with petty accusations and instead focus your attention on your goals, your projects, and your vision, you send a completely different message. You communicate that you're too busy building something important to worry about what small-minded people think of you. This doesn't mean you should ignore all feedback or become completely unaccountable. There's a difference between constructive criticism from people whose opinions you value and petty attacks from those seeking to diminish you. The key is learning to distinguish between the two and responding appropriately. Constructive criticism deserves thoughtful consideration and, when appropriate, genuine response. But accusations, innuendo, and attempts to bait you into defensive explanations deserve nothing more than strategic indifference. Here's something counterintuitive about human psychology: the less people know about your decision-making process, the more powerful they assume you are. This is because mystery creates an assumption of depth and complexity. When you explain every detail of your reasoning, you demystify yourself and make your thinking process seem ordinary. But when you make decisions and take actions without feeling compelled to justify every step, people begin to assume that you must know something they don't. They start to credit you with having access to information, insights, or strategies that aren't available to them. This assumption of superior knowledge becomes a form of soft power that serves you in future interactions. Think about it. Would you rather be known as someone who makes good decisions or someone who can eloquently explain why they made the decisions they made? The former suggests competence and wisdom, the latter suggests insecurity and a need for approval. This is why some of the most influential people in business, politics, and other fields often seem to operate with a certain mysterious quality. They don't feel compelled to show their work or prove their thinking to everyone who asks. They make their moves, achieve their results, and let their success speak for itself. There's a practical aspect to this strategy that's often overlooked. Defending yourself is exhausting. Every time you engage with critics and attempt to explain your actions or intentions, you're spending mental and emotional energy that could be better used elsewhere. Consider how much time and energy you've wasted in your life trying to convince people who were never going to be convinced anyway. Think about all the situations where you found yourself explaining the same points over and over to people who had already made up their minds about you. What could you have accomplished if you had redirected that energy toward your goals instead? This is particularly important for leaders and entrepreneurs who need to conserve their energy for the big decisions and strategic thinking that actually move the needle. Every minute spent explaining yourself to detractors is a minute not spent building, creating, or innovating. Moreover, there's a psychological phenomenon at play. The more you explain yourself, the more you begin to doubt yourself. When you're constantly justifying your actions to others, you start to internalize their skepticism. You begin to second-guess decisions that you were previously confident about. This internal doubt then affects your future decision-making and erodes your natural confidence. Understanding group dynamics is crucial to mastering this strategy. When you're in a social or professional setting and someone challenges you publicly, everyone else is watching to see how you respond. Your reaction in that moment doesn't just affect your relationship with your accuser, it shapes how everyone else perceives you going forward. If you respond defensively, if you start explaining and justifying, the group will unconsciously categorize you as someone who can be challenged and pushed around. They'll note that you felt the need to defend yourself, and they'll file away the information that you're vulnerable to this type of attack. But if you remain calm, composed, and unbothered, if you either ignore the challenge entirely or redirect it back onto your challenger, the group receives a very different message. They see someone who is secure enough in their position that they don't feel threatened by criticism. They observe strength, confidence, and self-assurance. This group perception then becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. The more people see you as someone who can't be easily rattled or manipulated, the less likely they are to try. Your reputation for strength becomes a form of protection, deterring future attacks and challenges. When you do choose to respond to criticism or challenges, the goal should never be to win the argument or prove your point. Instead, your objective should be to control the direction of the conversation and maintain your position of authority. This might involve redirecting the conversation toward your accuser's motivations. I'm curious why this is so important to you. Or it might involve reframing the entire discussion. I think we're focusing on the wrong issue here. The key is to avoid getting pulled into the specific details of the accusation while maintaining control over the broader narrative. Another effective redirection technique is to elevate the conversation to a higher level. Rather than getting bogged down in these details, let's talk about what we're really trying to accomplish here. This positions you as the mature, strategic thinker while implicitly characterizing your accuser as someone who gets distracted by petty concerns. You can also redirect by questioning the premise of the attack. I'm not sure I accept the assumption underlying your question. This forces your challenger to justify their accusation rather than putting you in the position of defending against it. The benefits of mastering this approach extend far beyond winning individual confrontations. Over time, your reputation for being unflappable and secure becomes one of your most valuable assets. People begin to seek your approval rather than trying to tear you down. They start to wonder what you know that they don't, rather than assuming they can manipulate or intimidate you. This shift in how others perceive you opens up new opportunities. You become someone who is consulted rather than challenged, respected rather than attacked. Your opinions carry more weight because people assume that if you're confident enough not to defend them, they must be well-founded. In professional settings, this can translate into faster promotions, better opportunities, and more respect from colleagues. In personal relationships, it can mean deeper connections based on mutual respect rather than power struggles. In social situations, it can mean becoming someone others look to for leadership and guidance. None of this is easy, especially at first. The urge to defend yourself when attacked is deeply ingrained. It feels natural, even necessary. Going against this instinct requires significant emotional discipline and self-awareness. You'll need to develop the ability to pause in the moment when you feel that familiar urge to explain or justify. You'll need to breathe, center yourself, and choose your response consciously rather than reacting automatically. This takes practice, but it becomes easier over time. It's also important to work on your underlying confidence and self-worth. Strategic silence only works if it comes from a place of genuine security. If you're internally anxious and insecure, those feelings will show through despite your attempts to appear calm. The outer technique must be supported by inner strength. As you begin to implement these strategies, there are several common pitfalls to be aware of. Overuse. Strategic silence is powerful precisely because it's unexpected. If you never engage with anyone about anything, you risk appearing aloof or disconnected. The key is knowing when to use this approach and when genuine engagement is more appropriate. Artificial behavior. If your silence and redirection feel forced or unnatural, people will sense the manipulation. This approach must come from a place of authenticity and genuine confidence, not from a desire to play games or control others. Timing issues. There are times when immediate response is necessary, particularly in crisis situations or when silence might be interpreted as admission of guilt. Learning to read these situations accurately is crucial. Lack of follow-through. If you choose to remain silent or redirect, you must be prepared to maintain that position consistently. Caving in and explaining yourself later undermines the entire strategy. It's important to understand that the techniques we're discussing aren't about becoming manipulative or cruel. They're about recognizing that your time, energy, and attention are valuable resources that should be invested wisely. When you refuse to engage with petty attacks and accusations, you're not being arrogant, you're being strategic about where you focus your efforts. This approach also comes with responsibility. When you hold power and influence, you have an obligation to use them wisely and ethically. The goal isn't to accumulate power for its own sake, but to position yourself so that you can make a positive impact and achieve meaningful goals. The person who masters these techniques should also be someone who uses their influence to lift others up, to create value, and to make positive contributions to their community and field. Power without purpose is ultimately empty and unfulfilling. Let's explore how these principles apply in various real-world situations. In the workplace, when a colleague publicly questions your decisions or competence, resist the urge to launch into a detailed defense of your track record. Instead, you might simply say, "I'm confident in my approach," and then redirect the conversation toward the results you're achieving or the goals the team is working toward. In relationships, when a romantic partner or family member accuses you of being distant or uncaring, don't immediately start listing all the ways you've shown your love. Instead, you might ask, "What would help you feel more connected to me?" This shifts the focus toward solutions rather than defensive explanations. In social situations, when someone tries to embarrass you or call you out in a group setting, maintain your composure and either ignore the comment entirely or redirect with a question like, "Is this really how you want to spend our time together?" In business negotiations, when the other party accuses you of being unreasonable or inflexible, don't justify your position point by point. Instead, you might say, "Let's talk about what outcome would work for both of us," thereby reframing the entire conversation. In our hyper-connected world, where every interaction can be recorded, shared, and scrutinized, the ability to maintain your composure and authority under pressure is more valuable than ever. Social media has created a culture where everyone feels entitled to an opinion about everyone else's behavior, and the temptation to respond to every criticism can be overwhelming. But this same environment also makes strategic silence and redirection more powerful. In a world full of noise, the person who speaks carefully and purposefully stands out. In a culture of constant explanation and justification, the individual who maintains their mystique and authority becomes increasingly rare and valuable. The leaders of tomorrow will be those who can navigate this landscape skillfully, maintaining their influence and effectiveness while avoiding the traps of over-explanation and defensive reactivity. They'll be the ones who understand that true power lies not in having all the answers, but in knowing which questions deserve their attention. Every day, you face moments that test your understanding of power and influence. Someone questions your judgment, challenges your authority, or tries to make you explain yourself. In these moments, you have a choice. You can react from a place of insecurity and defensiveness, or you can respond from a position of strength and strategic thinking. The choice you make in these moments doesn't just affect the immediate situation, it shapes your reputation, your relationships, and your future opportunities. It determines whether people see you as someone who can be pushed around or someone who commands respect. Remember, the most powerful response to criticism is often no response at all. The strongest position is one where you don't need to defend yourself because your actions, your results, and your character speak louder than any explanation ever could. Master the art of strategic silence. Learn to redirect rather than defend. Understand that your time and attention are precious resources that should be invested in building your future, not explaining your past. The world is waiting to see what you'll build with the energy you've been wasting on justification. The only question is, are you ready to stop explaining yourself and start commanding the respect you deserve? Your power lies not in the words you speak, but in the confidence with which you choose not to speak them. Use this knowledge wisely, and watch as your influence grows not through what you say, but through the unshakable strength of who you are.